Hi, David Vizard here, and you guys are watching PowerTec 10. In this episode, which will be, I guess, 148, we're going to look at something that I guess I've overlooked for quite a long time. But let me start here what prompted me to do this, otherwise it would have got left on the desk for way longer. I was going through the channel titles of various people's channels here, and I noticed that one that I had watched quite a bit was called Hidden Horsepower. At first I thought that it was just that one episode called that, but it wasn't. The series was called that. They had some pretty good stuff on there, so remember that one, Hidden Horsepower, go and check it. Now, I thought, just a minute, half of my videos are about potentially horsepower that is hidden from the average guy. For instance, that big one, episode 85 that I did on lobe centerline angle, essentially everything on it was about hidden horsepower. Not one or two, but it could be as much as 50 to 70 horsepower hidden. But anyway, if you haven't watched that one yet, watch this episode 85, and it completely reverses some of the common beliefs, but are actually myths, on cam selection. And like I said in one of my other videos, not one cam company has contradicted it yet, and it completely goes against everything on the subject of lobe centerline angles that they're saying. Not one. Not a squeak out of them. And by the way, it's been watched by over 200,000 people, so it's not like it's hidden. But anyway, let's get on to the subject of hidden horsepower. It occurred to me the other day that one of the easiest to hide horsepower deals for not much money involves cylinder heads, camshaft, and quench. Now, I'm not talking about high buck cylinder heads, I'm just talking about cylinder heads that deliver some compression ratio by one means or another. Small chamber, or you skim them to be small chamber. Piston clearance to cylinder head clearance, that's the Squish or Quench, and the camshaft. If you can address those three factors, you can make a stock engine really come alive. You have to pick the right cam, you have to do the quench, squish, and the compression ratio right, and you have to use a cylinder head that need not be anything but a stock cylinder head, but it has to be one that complements the situation. But anyway, we'll get into that. Now let's look at our subject. What's the difference between squish and quench? They differ essentially in the name only. It depends on whether you live on that side of the Atlantic or this side of the Atlantic. In the UK, and I believe in Europe in general, whatever language they're talking, the name for it is squish. So whatever squish is in German, that's what it is. Whatever is in French, that's what it is, I think. Over here, it's called quench. Why the difference? Well, it really is two different names describing two different things that result from the same thing. Figure that one out. I'm going to call it quench from now on because actually I prefer the word quench to squish. First, let's say what it is. It is just how close the piston approaches the quench pad, that is the flat surface of the cylinder head, when it reaches top dead center. Now, before we go any further, I want to address the situation of people lowering the compression ratio for either nitrous or a supercharger by skimming the top of the piston so that the piston gets less close to the top of the block, thereby increasing the quench to piston pad clearance. Let me say now, that is the worst possible way to do it, because Why are you lowering the compression ratio? You're doing this simply to avoid detonation. But the very mod you're doing increases the possibility of detonation. Now let me tell you a story here. Jerry Magnuson was a good friend of mine. We were real buddies. We worked together. Jerry didn't have a dyno for the Magnuson supercharger factory at the time. So he used to come over and use my dyno. And he got a new model supercharger out. Now I've got to tell you, Jerry was one of the great supercharger designers of the 20th century. His legacy still carries on with those Magnuson superchargers. They are probably the best mechanical positive displacement superchargers on the face of the planet. Their power consumption at cruise speeds is no more than what a regular alternator with zero power being drawn from it consumes. Nearly forgot the consumes bit there. Now, I won't go into the details of whys and wherefores there, but Jerry used to come over and we used to hang out at my dyno shop for sometimes a week at a time, testing superchargers. Well, one day he got to the point where he wanted to test what a realistic power would be for somebody who bought a supercharger and bolted it on to a not a hyper expensive motor, but a nice one, a 350 small block Chevy. That was the main market back then. And anyway, brought the engine over, and like everything Jerry does, it was gleaming like the crown jewels. This guy, he didn't know how to do an ugly job. Literally, that's not an exaggeration there. Dan Gurney said he was the best pattern maker, best fabricator, best, you name it. There's a whole lot of bests he had ever had, and he said the guy is not replaceable, period. I guess Dan Gurney and his All-American racers in Formula One probably knows a thing about cars, so we'd have to take that as a literal statement. But anyway, brought this engine over, 350, gleaming. We put it on the dyno, and this was what we supposed to be the end of a long row of tests. Fired it up, broke it all in and all that, changed the oil, got everything set, adjusted everything, torqued, retorqued the heads down, you name it, we did it. Fired it up, did some power runs. Well, it was down on horsepower. And of course we put the boost up and up and up, and we ran into detonation on it a little sooner than Jerry had anticipated. And I think, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but I know the compression was 8.8 to 1. And the engine was making somewhere around 580 horsepower. And it was a short cam, so it was making good torque. It was about 580 foot-pounds of torque as well. Not bad for a 350. Anyway, and he said, I can't understand that. He said, that's all good stuff in that motor. He said, not exotic cup car stuff, but good stuff. So we went to lunch and we pondered over it. And then I said to him, what's the compression on it? He said, 8.8. I said, are the pistons coming to the top of the block? He says, no, I got the 8.8 by taking 40 thousandths off the piston. So I said, your piston to quench pad clearance is what, 73 thousandths? He said, yeah, that's about right, about 70. And I said, there's your problem. That is your problem. He said, well, I didn't want to run the compression anymore. I said, look, let's do this. Take the engine home, strip it down, and deck the block so that you got a quench clearance of 30 thousandths. Now he got shaped pistons and all that, but anyway, by the time he decked the block so that he got 30 thousandths instead of 73, the compression was then 9.1 to 1. So it gone up 0.3, and about a week later brings the engine back, and he's looking a bit wary. Well, here's the thing. We went 2 more pounds per square inch before it detonated. That's 0.1. Point 2, it made 60 horsepower more. 60 horsepower just by decking the block. 40 thousandths. So, my point is this. Do not ever lower the compression by skimming the tops of the pistons to make them have more quench pad to piston clearance. All it will do is make your engine detonate easier and make less power. You have been warned. Now let's look at how much you can gain by taking the stock quench clearance and tightening it up. That's in our next section. Well, before we go into too much depth on what we can do with this, let's answer the first question, and that's one of mechanical consideration. Just how close can we run the piston surface to the cylinder head surface? Now, I'm sure a lot of you will think, well, you know, I guess we could have the piston come out of the bore and that. And we can. I usually run the piston out of the bore just a short amount, but we'll go into that later. Now, the question I want to pose right now is, how tight can we go? Typically, as it comes from the factory, we find that most small block Chevys are about, with a stock 35 thousandths head gasket, something like 60 thousandths down the bore. That is a number that has been, how shall I say, selected based on Charles Fayette Taylor's findings, and it's detailed in the 2-volume book, The Internal Combustion Engine by Charles Fayette Taylor. Now, I can't remember how they arrived at these figures, but for the most part, you need to ignore them. If you're a performance enthusiast, forget about them. And I'm probably thinking if you're an engine designer, forget about them as well. Here's the deal. That basically, up to a point, the tighter the quench gets, the more power the engine makes. How much power? Well, let's look at that now. It works out in the middle of the range that we're talking about here. If we go from 60 thousandths clearance down to, say, 25, it works out in a small block Chevy somewhere around 7 to 10 horsepower for every 10 thousandths. That's at the middle of the range. However, as it gets tighter, so we lose some of the benefits of that 10 horsepower per 10 thousandths. And as we go further away, so we lose some of that. So on average, I would say, if we're dealing with a small block Chevy, if we tighten it up from 60 thousandths to, say, 25, and I'm not saying that's the limit or that's where you should go yet, then what's that? 60, that's 35 thousandths. Well, you can expect that you'll pick up from your engine around 20 horsepower. I say around because it does depend on the type of head you have and a lot of other factors. Now let's have a look and see how tight we can go. You would think that this would be simple. Just go down to X number of thousandths. Well, it's dependent on so many things that you can't do that. Let's look at the clearance on the piston first. There's a lot of forged pistons that have quite big bore clearances and they rock at the top of TDC. Well, that rock is going to take up clearance. The piston and the head will make contact with a lot wider clearance than would be the case if you had a tight fitting piston. If the piston was a perfect fit in the bore, you could probably get, with typical stock rods, typical stock crank, the clearance down to about 18. But you can't have the pistons too tight in the bore. The only way you can have a minimal clearance bore is to have the pistons coated with something like line to line coating. I'll put their contact details. Now this is a coating that you can apply, or you can get applied to the pistons, that wears in. When there's no oil between the two surfaces, it abrades the coating. But as soon as oil gets between the two, it stops abrading the coating, and that's it. So it will set the clearance to the absolute minimum that can be had with whatever type of piston you have, which is good. And by the way, it's worth horsepower. And there's another bonus. It sure does make an engine quiet. If it's a street engine, it will quieten down that engine so that it's like a Cadillac engine. Now, most of us can't afford to do that to the pistons, right? That's an extra few $100. But if you are racing an engine and you've got expensive pistons in there, it is an absolute boon to the life of those pistons, and you get more horsepower. Now, let's look at a typical engine that the average guy would build, i.e. stock rods, cast crank, cast pistons. We'll say the piston clearance is about 4 thousandths with a cast piston, and it's a stock rod, and we'll say it's one of those powder metallurgy rods, which is a lot better than the forged rod that came previously, and we've got a good cast crank in there. Then the minimum clearance on that will be about 22 to 23 thousandths, as long as you don't rev it over 7,000. 6,900, those pistons will clear. With 7,000, they will just touch. So, you've got a forged piston. What can you do there? Well, you're going to have to use a little more clearance. Probably about 28. Now, a friend of mine, Mike Cook, who ran Mike Cook engines, and I think he's retired now, so don't bother trying to look him up. He got down to somewhere in the region of 18 thousandths clearance on a test engine, where he deliberately kept cutting the clearance. And one of the ways he compensated for piston rock was to cut the piston at an angle. So when it rocked at TDC, it came flat to the quench pad and the piston crown. So, and it just touched. So 18 thousandths, we have to say, is probably the rock bottom limit. Now, how can we get the benefit of that at the minimum cost? Well, the first thing is, and this is an advantage with a small block Chevy, you can't do this with a small block Ford, is to use a steel shim gasket. Instead of being some 30 thousandths to 32 thousandths thick, and sometimes as much as 35 thousandths thick, they're only 12 to 15. So that cuts it by 20 thousandths. As it happens, I've got a power curve where all we did was change the head gasket. Here it is. And yes, I know some of you are going to say, it's another one of Vizard's fancy colored. Then you're going to realize it's a chart, not a graph. There's good reason for the colors and a good reason for it being a chart. The colors are there so that I can define the columns easily. I'm pretty sure you can all understand most of the titles across the top, but when we get to the two white columns on the right of the chart, you've got CR gain and G gain. That is the gain from the compression ratio and the gain from the gasket swap. Let me explain those. When we changed the head gasket for a thinner one, we went from like 35 thousandths down to 12-ish. The compression ratio also changed. So there was a partial gain from the compression ratio change and a partial gain, hopefully, from the gasket change. And to demonstrate what the decrease in the quench clearance does for power, is necessary to separate the two. This was done by using recognized SAE formulas to calculate the effect on torque by the increase in compression. What was left over between that and the observed was what we had in terms of gains from the decrease in the quench clearance. There's also a few things you need to know about the data as presented here. Notice it's in 500 RPM increments instead of the usual 100 RPM increments. The reason for that is these tests were done on an old double absorber Go Power dyno. No data collection system on there. It was back to the old-fashioned way of doing it. Read the gauge and write it down on a sheet of paper. Hence every 500 RPM, not every 100. The other thing was the readings were put down to the nearest half a foot-pound. I did these tests while I was living in Tucson, Arizona. They were done at Denny Wyckoff's shop, and I remember we participated in these tests, one of us driving the engine, the other one writing down the numbers. Some details on the engine wouldn't go amiss either. I'm trying to recall most of this by memory, so don't take it as absolute. It was a 350. We had closed chamber type heads on it, like the 186s. They may have been double hump heads. A good valve job, stock size valves, a little bit of throat work done on both the intake and exhaust. Chamber was cleaned up, not modified, just cleaned up from rough edges. The cam was a hydraulic flat tappet Isky Megadyne on 108 lobe centerline. 268 or 272? Cannot remember. Induction was via an Edelbrock 2-plane manifold, and carburation was courtesy of a Holley spread bore carb. First, the red column. This is the increase in torque, rounded to the nearest half foot-pound, that was seen from just the head gasket change. In other words, it was the combination of the increase in compression and the reduction in the quench clearance. The blue column is the horsepower difference from changing the head gasket. In other words, it's the horsepower difference based on the figures in the red column. Changing to the thinner head gasket means that there is a reduction in quench clearance and an increase in compression. So there's a need for us to separate the two to find out just what part of that increase is due to the quench clearance reduction. Using accredited SAE formulas, I was able to calculate how much of the torque increase, and thus the power, was due to the compression ratio change. So the difference between that and the overall gain would give us the gain from the reduction of the quench clearance. The gain from just the compression ratio, that is one column short of the right-hand column's compression ratio gain. So you can see there's a pretty healthy gain from the compression. We're talking about 6 foot-pounds, fairly much throughout the RPM range. Now, what we see from the gain due to the reduction in quench is ranges from 3.7 foot-pounds right through to 7.3 foot-pounds at 5,500, which is, by the way, a gain of about 7.5 horsepower. So, a reduction of quench is worth power. Now, that's just due to 20 thousandths reduction in quench clearance. Well, I'm just going to run through a few implications on what we've talked about so far as it pertains to budget builds. Now, this doesn't mean that I've told you everything about quench. Far from it. However, I've given you enough to keep you going. What we've still yet to cover, and that will be in a shortly presented edition, maybe in the next 5 or 6. We're going to look at tapered quench, we're going to look at directed quench, and we're going to look at scavenge plateaus and the way they work in conjunction with quench. So we're not done yet, that's still to come, but what I want to talk about here is the test engine that we used. Now let's say you're doing a real budget build and you don't want to skim the block. You're going to try and avoid skimming the head. You're going to get new pistons, so aim for flat top pistons. Try and get a cylinder head that is maybe 64cc chamber or 68, either of those will do. The steel shim gasket, now this only applies to the small block Chevy. Unfortunately Fords don't have it, so you're going to have to do some decking of the block if you want to simulate this. Now once you've got the compression up into the 9s, what you now need is a cam that is going to work with a stock head, and I'm going to make this really quick. A 268 or a 272, or is it 274? Isky Megadyne cam. They come on 108 lobe centerline angles, which is very close to being dead right for a spec like this. They will make buku torque numbers, as you see in the deal there. Put a decent intake manifold on there, 2-plane intake manifold, and a decent carb, and you will have somewhere in excess of 400 foot-pounds of torque, and power figures running better than 375 horsepower. If everything's good on there and you get some good pistons and good rings so friction's low, could be as much as 400. Now let me tell you, if you've got a genuine 400 horsepower in your 1500 series truck, it isn't slow, right? It will spin the wheels into second gear, that's for sure. You will surprise a lot of people. Now, you'll need to have headers on there for that as well, because the log manifold will just destroy half the work you've done on the block. Now that's about it for now. Look out for the second edition on the effects of quench and how it affects our combustion, and we'll go on from there. But for now, don't forget to subscribe, like, get notified when we're on with a new broadcast, and comment. And share. Please share. Now after all those instructions, I think I'll let you go. So thank you for watching.